My name is Yawn, and I'm the Education Chair on the ISC2 Miami Chapter Board. I'm an information security and compliance professional with a good amount of experience on AWS and helping organizations architect compliant AWS workloads. Definitely excited about the opportunity to present to this. So let's go ahead and get started with the session. The highlights listed here on the agenda are what we will discuss, obviously beginning with the well-architected framework, specifically the security pillar to set the foundation for the session. Then we'll dive into the overview of these three key services that are listed here, and then move into the console, which I think is going to be one of the most important parts of this session, where you'll get to see a chance for me to walk through some of these tools and see how they look live in an AWS account if you haven't had the opportunity to see these tools before within a live environment. And if you are curious about practicing on AWS and setting up test environments, I encourage you to set up a free tier account. It's available to anyone to go out there and test things out, especially things that we discuss here today. So the well-architected framework was developed by AWS to help cloud architects make informed decisions about their architecture in a cloud-native way, really focusing on helping architects understand the impact of their design decisions on their infrastructure. And AWS makes it clear that this framework is not a process, is not an audit mechanism. This is a process to encourage conversation for reviewing your architecture. And the goal of the well-architected framework is to ensure that the foundation of your applications are built according to appropriate operational excellence, security, reliability, performance efficiency, and cost optimization pillars. There's obviously trade-offs when making some of these architecture decisions between some of these pillars. For example, if you're operating in a dev environment, you may reduce costs at the expense of reliability, or you're in e-commerce, you may prioritize performance since performance impacts revenue and urges your customers to make a purchase. However, AWS makes it clear, and I agree with them, that security and operational excellence should not be traded off. Those are two that you should always strive to maintain according to best practices. We're going to focus on the security pillar today, but there are a few resources that we'll send out after this call regarding the overall well-architected framework. There's a white paper that's associated with the overall framework, as well as individual white papers for each pillar. And then there's a blog post recently that I published on InfoSec magazine as well that talks about the security pillar that we'll send out after this session. And I encourage you, if you're interested in AWS certs or just AWS in general, the white papers are very important in those certification exams. You will find a lot of questions directly from those white papers, so they're a great start when you're trying to figure out some things on AWS. So moving into the security pillar, the security pillar focuses on the ability to protect information and systems, focusing on 5 areas of concern. Who can do what with identity and access management, detecting security events with detective controls, protecting systems with infrastructure protection, protecting confidentiality and the integrity of data, and as well as responding to security events in your incident response program. Now, these 5 areas are going to look very familiar to all of us that have been working in InfoSec for some time. Each focus area is a component of a mature cybersecurity program, and I'm not going to rehash these components because I'm sure some of us are aware of those. But when examining these 5 focus areas, I think it's important to look at each focus area as an integrated component of your security program, not individual siloed processes. There's obviously overlap between many of these areas, and it's important to consider how each focus area builds on or influences another. An example of this is with the detective controls and incident response focus areas. As an organization detects potential security trends or events, this automatically feeds the incident response process. And the graphic above, the graphic here shows that, right? It shows that AWS CloudTrail is in the detective control section as well as in the incident response section. And the other thing that I want to highlight here are all of these different security services you see here, these logos presented on this slide. AWS has a good amount of security services that are native to the cloud, to their cloud service, that allows you to implement security best practices with these services that were designed specifically for these purposes. So it's a great starting point if you're launching a new application on AWS to start with some of these services that we'll hop into here in a few minutes. And we're going to review the services here that are outlined in the red boxes, which I believe are really foundational to establishing your security program on AWS and managing an application, focusing on those identity and access management, as well as those detective controls. These other services are discussed in detail in the security pillar white paper, which I encourage you all to go out and read and take a look at. But again, we're going to focus on IAM and CloudTrail and Trusted Advisor. One note on that security pillar white paper, you won't find Trusted Advisor as a service listed in that white paper. They don't consider it a detective service, at least in this white paper, but as you'll see in this overview, you can use it to detect common security misconfiguration. So definitely encourage you to take a look at Trusted Advisor, but if you're reviewing the white paper, you're not going to see that particular service listed there. So like I mentioned, we're going to discuss identity and access management, CloudTrail, and Trusted Advisor. And with each of these services during this slide deck, what I'll discuss are some general information about the services, some things that you can do with each services, and then some things you can implement to reduce the operational disruption on your compliance assessments or cybersecurity assessments. So to begin with, identity and access management is the service to address the identity and access management focus area. And it's obviously essential to AWS security, controlling access to AWS services and resources. Identity and access management is a key part of any information security program, ensuring that only authorized and authenticated users can access resources in a manner that, and only in a manner that's permitted, thinking about those concepts of least privilege. And there are a number of approaches to identity and access management. AWS lists these two that are displayed on the slide here, which talks about how you can protect your AWS credentials as well as implementing fine-grained authorization. And there's a few ways that you can go about this within AWS, beginning with the root account, which is the account that has access to all services and resources. It can ultimately delete your application or your account from the cloud as well. So you should protect that at all costs. You shouldn't use it. You should create less privileged users, delete the access keys associated with that root account, as well as lock away the password and not use it for everyday tasks. Some other things that you can do that you're familiar with protecting AWS credentials is requiring multi-factor authentication for every user. And there's some interesting things you can do there where you can prevent anyone from performing really any function other than implementing multi-factor authentication on their account through the use of IAM policies and some triggers there within the AWS console that really restricts anyone from operating an account without multi-factor authentication being enabled, which is a great feature to ensure that you always have that in place. AWS policies are really a great tool to implement some of these least privileged principles, ensuring that the authenticated users are only permitted to perform the most minimal set of functions, which really limits your blast radius, right, if your credentials are compromised. And the policies allow you to outline what a user can do on your AWS account. And an important note with identity and access management is every user starts with no permissions. So every user is a denied by default, and you have to explicitly allow any action via an IAM policy, which sometimes organizations get a little lazy and everybody becomes an admin, especially in these smaller organizations, which you really shouldn't do. You should use these policies to implement some of this fine-grained authorization. And you can also use roles on identity on the IAM service to provide temporary credentials that can be assumed by another user or AWS service. So there's a number of things that you can do on identity and access management to address this particular focus area and address these 2 points. We'll take a look at some as we dive into the console, but some of the same concepts that you always think about with identity and access management, implementing least privilege and role-based access control, you can do within AWS using this tool as well. The last bullet point here, the IAM credential report, this really gets into the meat of what this session is about for cybersecurity assessments. The credential report is a feature on IAM that can assist administrators with access reviews and assessments. It provides a holistic view of the status of all IAM users within your account. It can be generated via the web browser, through the AWS console, or programmatically through the CLI. And we're going to walk through how to generate the report and some details of what the report entails. But the use case for this report is twofold, really. I think you can use it internally. I've seen it used internally for access reviews to go through and validate those that have access actually need it. And an example of this is, early in a startup, there's a CEO, maybe there's only 5 of you, and the CEO has access to your AWS account, and he's a privileged user, or he or she is a privileged user, and they're operating daily in that account. But as the organization grows and scales, they no longer need that access, but that account still exists. And this credential report is a great way to identify those users that haven't logged in a while and may not need access anymore. The second way to use this report is obviously for your assessments, providing it to your auditors. Allows them to test multiple controls, like when a new user is created, is multi-factor authentication enabled for those users? When was the last time the root account used? Access key usage? A whole lot of information all contained within one report, which allows your assessors to use one report to test multiple controls, ultimately reducing the time that you have to spend with them during an assessment and the amount of time you have to spend gathering evidence as well. Additionally, on that initial slide, you saw AWS organizations and AWS directory service. So just really quick on those. AWS organization lets you centrally manage and enforce policies for multiple AWS accounts. So if you're in a large organization, you all have multiple, sometimes there's organizations out there with hundreds of AWS accounts, and you want to make sure there's no drift from your overall security policies. AWS organizations is a great way to do that. The second service, AWS Directory Service, is for Microsoft Active Directory, also known as Managed Active Directory, Microsoft AD. It enables your directory workloads and AWS resource to be managed using that same AD instance that you currently have. So if you're hosted with AD, you don't have to redo your entire identity federation process if you're moving to the cloud. So we'll move over into these detective services, which are addressing the detective control section. We're going to talk about CloudTrail and Trusted Advisor, but there are a number of additional AWS services here in this family, from AWS Config to Amazon CloudWatch to Amazon Inspector, which all provide you the ability to address two key components of the detective controls family, which we'll look at the next screen. And detective services that we'll talk about are an essential part of governance frameworks, and they can be used to support quality process, legal or compliance obligations, and for threat identification and response efforts. So AWS outlines these two approaches for the detective controls family that you see here: capturing and analyzing logs, and then integrating auditing controls and workflow. And the key service here is going to be CloudTrail. It's the logging service on AWS, enables governance, compliance, operational auditing, and risk auditing of your AWS account. Allows your administrators to continuously monitor, retain account activity for an extended time up to how you configure it, and includes all actions taken in your AWS account, whether through the console, whether through SDKs, the CLI, all API calls that are made in your AWS account, you get rich detail about. So that really helps address that first part about capturing and analyzing logs on your AWS account. And this is the service that's enabled for everyone as soon as they join. There's some additional things that we'll look at in the console that you have to do to retain logs for longer than 90 days. But when you first start an AWS account, CloudTrail will be there operational for you. Now, the second part of this bullet point is really where I think is the most important, because just logging is not enough, right? We understand that the volume of information and log data flowing from modern complex architectures makes analyzing this data manually and with humans almost impossible. And best practices in modern security is to develop a workflow and automation for security events and findings to enable security teams to react to those potential threats. So you want to make sure that your teams can see the events and systems are in place to react to those events, and you can see exactly what they did and perform some functions, whether that's alerting or going out and actually remediating a particular incident. And an example of this, of showing that intertwined nature that we talked about before between those two focus areas, is you have the ability to detect an event. You determine whether the event was normal or abnormal and it should be investigated, and then you route this information to the correct remediation workflow, which could be a ticketing system. It could be a Lambda function to automatically execute a task on your behalf if you know that misconfiguration should not have been in place. And one example of this that we all are probably familiar with are seeing the common misconfigurations of S3 buckets that are allowed public access available that cause breaches. And S3 is, or simple storage service, is object storage on AWS. It's one of the original AWS services. And you may have seen FedEx and Walmart recently that had breaches where publicly sensitive data was publicly exposed and millions of individuals were impacted. With CloudTrail and some of these integrations of auditing, control, and workflow, those breaches could have been prevented. CloudTrail could have detected when those administrators made those buckets public. They could have went out and sent that information to Amazon CloudWatch, specifically Amazon CloudWatch events, routed this information through a number of other services like Config, SNS, and Lambda, to automatically remediate that misconfiguration. So automatically take that S3 bucket from a public bucket to a private bucket, effectively eliminating the breach that we read about in the news. So this is important to see that integrating of auditing controls and notification workflow, because with logging you can do so much more. And on AWS, it's easy. It's very clear here how you can use CloudTrail and other services to implement this integration of auditing control and workflow. And just to bring this back to cyber assessment, you can't really find too many compliance or reporting frameworks, whether that's PCI DSS, SOC 2, HIPAA, ISO, HITRUST, et cetera, that don't require a robust log management control and program to be in place. Your auditors are going to want to see that you're logging, what events you're logging, why those events are important to you, and what you're doing with that information. And as we mentioned earlier, just logging is not enough, right? Configuring CloudTrail in the manner above and integrating with these other services is really a simple way to initially address this requirement and begin those conversations about how you're logging and improving those to your assessors. One common concern with organizations and auditors are the use of other tools, other SIEM tools, or instant-based logging and some of this monitoring. And you can incorporate those services that are outside of AWS or instant-based logging with CloudTrail and CloudWatch, to perform some of that auditing control and workflow. So we'll hop into Trusted Advisor here for the last service in the PowerPoint deck, and then we'll hop into the console. Appreciate you all staying with me so far. Trusted Advisor is a service that continuously reviews your AWS infrastructure in real time against best practices. And it does this across 5 categories: cost, performance, security, fault tolerance, and service limits. And I'm really not sure why those don't match up one-to-one with the well-architected framework we talked about earlier. But luckily, we're talking about security here, and that does line up. And the security checks under Trusted Advisor are a great way to detect any potential issues in your environment. There's 6 core security checks that are available to every single person that starts an AWS account. You're able to have access to these checks, and they're going to automatically go out and check your resources against this service. And these include S3 public bucket access checks. So to bring it back to FedEx and Walmart, really have no excuse there, where they had a tool that was already checking to see if that misconfiguration was in place, as well as multi-factor authentication on the root account, something that is another control that we talked about that Trusted Advisor is going out and checking. A number of others that we will review here in the console in a second. The most important part about Trusted Advisor and the best use case I've seen here is in a cybersecurity assessment. I've seen that this report can provide so much data that allows, at a very early stage in the assessment, if you get this out to your assessors pretty early, allows your assessors to start to map out your environment. You can see which VPCs are in place, which RDS instances are out there, which EC2 instances are out there, where are they located, how are they configured, are there any really glaring holes initially in the environment. You all get this from the Trusted Advisor report. This is another report where you get to use once or receive it one time and test many controls. So again, for your teams that are going through these assessments, this alleviates a lot of screenshots, a lot of back and forth with assessors, because it is a holistic view into your account. One note on Trusted Advisor: it is a global service versus a regional service, and this is a concept to be familiar with on AWS. And we'll dive into a little bit of the details about that in the console, but then the idea there is that some services on AWS are operating in specific regions, whether that's in US East 1 or US West 1 or wherever region those are. And then there's other services that are global, and they're going to impact every resource across your entire account, regardless of the region that they are hosted in. And what's important there is that Trusted Advisor is going to test these misconfigurations across your entire account. And there's oftentimes that assessors or security administrators fall into a trap of looking at misconfigurations or configurations of security on AWS with regional services and not global services. So you're not really getting the full picture of the account, and it'll be pretty clear once we hop into the console what that looks like. So before we hop over into the console, I'll check the chat real quick to make sure there's no questions that I missed, and pause here just to make sure that there's no questions. Looks like there's only one regarding the ability to watch this shortly after the presentation. Yes, and I see that there was a response. Yeah, we will be recording this and uploading to YouTube, and it'll be available on our website. So I'll go ahead and hop into the console and we'll walk through this demo, and then we will have an opportunity for everyone to unmute and ask any questions. So as I'm going through this, some of you may see some sensitive information. I know we are in a security session. You may see some account IDs and things like that and some test user accounts. This is a Miami chapter test AWS account that will be deleted shortly after this session. So if your security antennas go up after seeing some sensitive information, know that this account will be removed shortly after, and there's nothing really nefarious anyone will be able to do. So if you've never seen inside of AWS Management Console, this is a quick look at it. It's pretty self-explanatory, but up here in the top right, you will see the name of the organization. And then again, you're going to look at this as we're going through this demonstration of the region that's up here. Regional versus global services is going to be an important concept. So you can go to a different service by looking at this services drop-down menu. And obviously what we'll care about is the security, identity, and compliance section. There's also a management and governance section that a lot of security professionals would be concerned with. And if you want to go to a service, you don't have to necessarily know where they are. You can just type in the particular service that you're aiming to go to. So we'll get started with identity and access management. And just to begin with, as soon as you hop into IAM, there's these 5 security status checks. And these are things that I mentioned before that we were talking about regarding the root account, regarding creating individual IAM users. These are things that AWS is going to remind organizations of every time you go over here to the identity and access management console. And it's things that if you're an assessor and you're going through this with your clients, or if you're a security admin internally and you're going through this with your organization, you see this in the AWS account. If any of these pop up red, go ahead and have them address it now. You know, these are things that really should be non-negotiable. There's not a lot of justification for not implementing any of these 5 checks. So it's a great way just to, as a snapshot, find out exactly are you doing the basics right there as you hop into the console. Another thing to look at here, you have these different types of identity and access management resources. You have users, you have groups, you have roles, policies there, as well as identity providers, all things that you can use to set up role-based access control. The thing I want to dive into a little bit further are the policies. So there's two really important concepts here to think about on these policies. And again, these are going to provision what a user can do on AWS, and everyone starts with no permissions. But there's these customer managed policies versus AWS managed policies. And with the AWS managed policies, there's these AWS managed job function policies, which are great for you to, again, get started on AWS. If you have database administrators, system admins, some network admins, and some regular overall admins as well that need full access, you can use these job function policies and organize your users by their roles as suggested by role-based access best practice. We'll look at the database administrator one really quick just to show you an example of this. AWS policies are written in JSON, but fairly easy to understand if you have any familiar with JSON. The way that this works is you'll see that for a database administrator, it makes sense for them to have full access or additional access to some of the data stores here. So our relational database servers, or Redshift, or Elasticache, all the DynamoDB, all of these are data stores that it would make sense for a database administrator to have full access to. And now if a user or an organization is hosting their databases or not hosting their databases on an EC2 instance, it wouldn't make sense for your database administrator to have administrative access to your servers or to your EC2 instances. So you can see how this policy is configured, and you can go ahead and copy and paste these policies to maybe change a few things, or use them exactly as they are intended here, which is a great resource. One for you to implement policy that you know were set up according to particular job functions, but also if you're talking through what policies are in place at your organization with your auditors, and you're having that conversation. This is an easy way to move through that conversation because you can show them that you're using these AWS managed policies. One easy way to show them that is this little square next to the policies. It's signifying that these are AWS managed policies. And the JSON outputs of these policies and what's allowed and what's not allowed are public facing. So if your auditors know that these policies are AWS managed policies, they have the ability to go out and find out exactly what they provision and maybe reduce the amount of time you guys are spending together talking through policies. Another interesting feature here that you can use related to policies, whether internally or externally, is the policy simulator. where you can go out and see, what are users able to do. If I want to see what a particular user is able to do, I can check this user. I want to see, does AJ have the ability to delete an S3 bucket? Something that I probably don't want him to do. So we'll check really quick. Can I delete an S3 bucket? And you run the simulation and you find out that I am able to do that. So maybe you want to go out and remediate that and fix that. So that's a great way to also use an IAM feature to identify, are you abiding by least privilege principles and some of those best practices we talked about earlier. Lastly, here is the credential report. So like I mentioned, you would just go to the IAM console here to download it. Pretty simple. You can only download one report every 4 hours. So you click download a report. You can also generate this from the CLI programmatically if that's what you'd like. And here's an example of the output of the report. So I highlighted a few columns that are important here. User creation time, password enabled or not, when's the last time the password was used, is multi-factor authentication enabled, access key information, a lot of really good data here in this report that, again, auditors can use to test multiple controls. And you can use to perform access reviews as well. So really useful report there under the credential report, and some really useful services here under identity and access management. There's a couple other things here that are fairly important that I think if you're going to spin up an AWS account to look at. One is AWS Access Analyzer, which is a newish tool that it's a least privileged tool. Make sure that you're not providing access to any users that don't need it, as well as any resources don't have unlimited access out there, as well as cross-account access, a great way to segment access either through internally organization or to external users. All right, let's hop over to CloudTrail, which again is the logging service here on AWS. And like I mentioned before, you're going to start with 90 days worth of logs. But in order to have some longer term retention there, you're going to have to create a trail. And what creating a trail does is essentially sending your logs to an S3 bucket where you're able to set some of these lifecycle policies and long-term storage and some storage security settings as well. So if you're just starting out on CloudTrail, the 90 days may be fine, but after you exceed those 90 days, you may need those logs to last a little bit longer, excuse me, to abide by log retention requirements, as well as to make sure that you have the ability to go back and look at what happened over the course of 365 or longer days. So we'll hop into a trail really quick and just take a look at some of the key things to look at. So the first thing is applying the trail to all regions. Important concept. If you see up here, we're in the North Virginia region. Again, global versus regional service. CloudTrail is a regional service, but you can apply this trail to all regions, and you should. Even if you're only hosted in one region right now, if your organization scales and grows in the future, you don't want to have to worry about if you're logging. So just go ahead and apply it to all regions from the beginning, so that your organization is logging the necessary events from the start. These are the type of events that you would log. We're not going to get into the details of each of these. The management events are just simple things that you would perform as a user, whether that's creating a subnet or changing an IAM policy, or even resources performing functions as well would be tracked here. Some other things you can do with the security perspective on that S3 bucket that's storing your logs. You can enable encryption. You can enable some log file validation for integrity. And you can publish these to SNS as well if you'd like. Now, and Donna, I'll just go ahead and address your question now, because I think it's a good question to talk about. So the use of CloudTrail is actually free. What you will pay for is the storage in S3. S3 costs are very minimal. I think it's like a percentage of a cent per gigabyte or something like that, but very, very low cost. So the cost that you would pay for is for the storage, not for the actual use of CloudTrail. Great question. So when we think about the integration of auditing controls and workflow, right? That's where we talked about earlier. The way that you would do this with CloudTrail is you'd send these events over to your CloudWatch logs. And the beauty of AWS, and one of the things I hope to drive home tonight, is how much you can do from a security perspective with a little bit of effort and not a ton of knowledge. You don't need a full security team or have years of experience in security to implement some of these things, because AWS has made it pretty easy. And one of those ways is by providing a CloudWatch alarm AWS CloudFormation template. With this template, you can, and CloudFormation is AWS's version of a configuration management tool. It allows you to use programming languages or a simple text file to model and provision resources in an automated and secure manner. And what you can do here with CloudFormation is download this template. You would you upload it into the console and go ahead and implement it. And this is going to alert you on key security events, all with really a few clicks of the button. So things such as someone deleting an EC2 instance, someone changing a security group, someone modifying a network ACL, all really simple to do directly here in the CloudTrail console by clicking configure. And you would use this CloudFormation template again to implement this, which is just a really good way to get a head start on security, right? You can begin performing some of that integration of auditing controls and workflow. And like I mentioned earlier with CloudWatch, is you can send some of these events to a Lambda function or another service to go ahead and remediate activities for you. And there's, I obviously can spend an hour on CloudTrail. I get really excited talking about it because I think it's a great service. And maybe that's a future session to talk about how we integrate CloudTrail with other services and walk through some demos there. But for the sake of time, let's move over to Trusted Advisor to finish up. So like I mentioned, Trusted Advisor is going to check across these 5 categories. We're obviously going to focus on the security category. And just to really quick begin with, we'll look at the S3 bucket example here that we talked about before. So Trusted Advisor provides you for each check a description of the check, the alert criteria. So what are all of these different things that are going to trigger an alert? And then also, what should you do with a recommended action here of what a user should go ahead and implement to address this particular security issue, as well as some additional resources. And you can see all of the associated metadata with the particular misconfiguration. So again, great resource here to detect misconfigurations. These are the 6 core checks that I mentioned earlier, available to any user, regardless of your support plan. So things that we talked about this evening that you should be doing no matter what, right, in your account. And AWS agrees with that by providing these for free for everyone. Now, if you do have a support plan, there are some really, at least in my opinion, some really cool checks. One of them that I like a lot is this exposed access key check that goes out and checks popular code repos for any access keys that have been exposed to the public or with any irregular usage. So it's really cool check to have in place, as well as a interesting thing to include in any compliance reports that you have to show and differentiate yourselves from your customers. So one last point here before we end is the global versus regional, and I think this is just really important to get down here this evening. So again, here in the top right, you see that AWS Trusted Advisor is a global resource. And what I'm going to do is before I do that, you see here under the security group check, it says that there's 2 of 3 security group rules that are allowing unrestricted access to a specific port. And that's important to remember. Just remember the 2 of 3 there. If we hop over to the EC2 console where your servers or instances will be, we'll see here that there are 2 security groups in place over here in this North Virginia. So up here in the top right again, you see your regions. We're in the North Virginia region, US East 1. There's 2 security groups here, and these all look pretty decent. You're allowing access over port 22 from a private IP. No issues identified here. But if we go back over to Trusted Advisor, and we see that there's those 2 security groups that were identified as having issues, you may be kind of confused about why those didn't pop up. And the reason is because the region of where those security groups are located are over in the US 1 region. So if we click into this security group, and while that's loading, I'll stay here just to dive into this a little further. Trusted Advisor is looking across all of your resources, regardless of the region they're hosted in. What we were just looking at there in the North Virginia region is showing you what security groups are in place in the US East 1 region. But that's not enough. If you're an assessor or you're looking at your environment, you cannot just take what's going on in a particular region as far as the configurations of your overall environment from a security group perspective, or really from any regional service perspective, which is why Trusted Advisor is such a great tool and a great report, because it does give you that holistic view across the entire environment. So important to keep in mind and remember up there. But I hope this was useful. The demonstration, definitely, I hope it was useful. We'll go ahead and lift some of those restrictions as far as muting and sharing your screen, so we can engage in any Q&A and open discussion. But I definitely appreciate everyone for taking the time to listen this evening.